turn my soul into a raging fire. Come on, won't you turn my soul into a raging fire? Come on, till we lose control into a raging fire.
He scores! Alec Martinez gets the goal. The Los Angeles Kings have won the Stanley Cup.
Welcome to the latest edition of the First Take UK podcast. This is the first of our NHL previews. I'm delighted to be joined by NHL.com writer Tal Pinchevsky. Tal, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm great, thanks. Thanks for having me. And season's almost here. It's very exciting.
This is it. And I suppose a big question for you is, when the season's over, what do you do with your time whilst you wait for the new hockey season to start?
It seems like the off season is getting shorter and shorter. We always seem to have something to cover. There's, immediately after the Cup final, the draft starts. After that, there's free agency, and that's gone from a 1 or 2 day event to sort of something that lingers on the rest of the summer. And there's development camps, and usually in August it's a little quiet. That's when people decide to go on vacation. Other than that, 1 month though, there's no lack of things to cover in the NHL.
Isn't that just the way of the world now, though, is like all the sports, it just seems like it's a year-long event now almost.
It does seem that way. I mean, you even speak to players from back in the 70s and 80s, and they'll tell you they had a real off-season, and players today don't seem to have one at all. They're training, they take maybe 2 weeks off, and then they're pretty much training and skating the rest of the summer. I think back in a few years ago, they'd literally take the entire summer off, completely get away from their fitness routine, and then try and get back in shape when training camp started. That is definitely not the case anymore.
No, this is it. So the players are going to be back shortly. I mean, we've got around about a month to go now to the start of the NHL season. So we're going to kick things off and we're going to preview the Metropolitan division. Now, the divisional alignment change coming into last season, I'm not a fan of some of these divisional names, but do you think the new alignment kind of changed things or affected certain teams going into last season, bearing in mind some of the scheduling changes that happened because of it?
Well, I mean, there were quite a few changes. Obviously, you had Detroit and Winnipeg and Columbus changing conferences, that really changes their travel schedule up. But I think everyone seems to be pleased with how that worked out. I think there was maybe a little speculation with going from 6 divisions to 4. But I think everyone in the end was pleased with the configuration in terms of the top 3 teams in each division making the playoffs, and then everyone else competing for the two wild cards. I think it does make for a little more parity and competitiveness. I mean, you had for years a Southeast division that was considered far and away the weakest division in the league, and it seemed like the Capitals would run away with that division every year. And now Washington has to contend with this Metropolitan division that, every team seemed to get off to a pretty poor start last year. But the way I look at it now, it might be one of the more competitive divisions. So I think you can't just win a weak division and make the playoffs anymore. You really have to compete with some pretty competitive teams to make it out of your division and make the playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, this particular division is incredibly tough. I mean, if we start with the team that won the division last year, the Pittsburgh Penguins, I mean, Pittsburgh are loaded. They're a stacked team, and they were going into last season. And then they had the shock in the playoffs of going out after being up 3-1 against the New York Rangers, and then certain people lost their jobs because of that. Do you think what happened last season will be on the players' minds going into this season?
It would be hard for it not to be. I mean, it resulted in, they were embarrassed against the Rangers. Let's be honest. They were up 3-1 in that series and ended up losing in 7 games, and it was considered another disappointing playoff. And this time, it resulted in all kinds of wholesale changes. Dan Bylsma's gone. Fred Shearo's gone. The whole front office was turned over. The coaching staff. A bunch of free agents left, most notably UC Jokinen and Matt Niskanen. So there have been some serious changes with this team. And I think the motivation obviously behind all of it is that this is a team that has played well in the regular season and seems to, win their division most of the time. But when it comes to the playoffs, they just can't get to the big game. And that's what this season, I believe, is all about. I think this season is all about, we expect to do well in the regular season, but now it's time to really make it count in the playoffs. And I think that, I think they'll win this division again. And I think they'll be more competitive in the playoffs. They have a new coach in Mike Johnston who had a great record in junior hockey, and they brought in some players that I like. I like the acquisition of Christian Ehrhoff on the point on defense. I think he's a very cheap addition because he was bought out by the Sabres, so they didn't have to pay him too much. He'll fit in great. And I think it'll be more of the same with the Penguins. I think I won't say they'll run away with this division, but they should win it.
Yeah, I think so as well. I mean, is it a case for them like it is for so many teams now across so many sports where it's just about getting to the playoffs and making sure you're healthy come when the playoffs come around? And it seems to be like this mentality now that's growing into all sports where teams are just not coasting through the regular season, but it isn't their end goal. So why should they go out at like 100% almost? Because the main thing is about just getting that healthy team to those playoffs.
Yeah, well, health is obviously key. You look at the two teams that made it to the final last season, the Rangers and the Kings. They were both remarkably lucky with their rosters. Neither team really suffered any major injuries. Definitely not during the playoffs, and really not that much over the course of the season. So I think when you do look back on teams that have won the Stanley Cup or perhaps made a major run to the Cup final, more often than not, they do get a little lucky with health. But unless these teams are hiring, some sort of voodoo doctor to help with that, I don't know how you can really strategize for that. But yeah, I wouldn't say they're not going 100% during the regular season, because there are still jobs, even though training camp, people are competing for jobs in training camp, they're doing the same during the season. I mean, everyone, it's still the National Hockey League, and teams and players are still going all out. And going 100% during the regular season. I would just say during the playoffs, it gets magnified to 120%. I mean, the intensity of the Stanley Cup playoffs, I think, is hard to match in any sport. So, but yeah, like you said, I mean, health is key, but there's only so much you can do to ensure that your team is healthy by the time the playoffs start.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on it there. I mean, for me, the playoffs is the ultimate grind. It's 2 months, you're playing every other night, and every game seems like it's a pressure cooker scenario. You have so many overtime games. You have game sevens, and I think, not to go back over too much about last year's playoffs, but I thought last year's playoffs was one of the best playoff seasons we've seen in a fair length of time. I thought it was incredible right from the start all the way up to the Stanley Cup Finals, where you did have 3 games decided in overtime.
Absolutely. I think. I mean, the season hasn't even started yet, so it's a little early to talk about which playoffs will be better, but the 2015 Stanley Cup playoffs are going to have a tough time matching just how incredible the playoffs were last season. I mean, even series opening round series that a lot of people probably weren't paying as much attention to, like the Ducks and the Stars or Columbus and Pittsburgh. I mean, those were some of the most exciting series to watch. The number of games that were either won or tied in the last minute of regulation, the number of overtime games, the number of 7-game series. There was one sweep in the entire Stanley Cup playoffs last season, and it was in the opening round. So basically almost the entire playoffs were these 6 or 7 game series where for at least a few days fans had no idea which way it was going to go. We saw the established teams roll, we saw other teams emerge. I mean, it was absolutely incredible, but that's the playoffs. That's why everyone loves the playoffs in hockey.
No, without a doubt. If there is a question mark for the Penguins going into this season, what might it be?
Well, I think for me and for a lot of people, it'll be who's going to be skating with Evgeny Malkin. I mean, you have a guy here who is arguably the best player in the world, one-on-one. He can do things that I don't think anyone else can do. I mean, we've seen him take over games by himself. And he had a couple of great line mates last season in James Neal and Jussi Jokinen, and they're both gone. Neal was traded to Nashville, and Jokinen signed with Florida. And there's no obvious names, I think, that could potentially replicate the kind of goal scoring that those two wingers provided with Malkin. I think the most obvious choice would probably be Patrick Hornqvist, who has established himself as someone who's capable of scoring goals. They got him from Nashville in exchange for Neal, so the expectation is he will be on Malkin's wing, and hopefully can replicate some of the scoring that James Neal provided. I mean, here's Neal was an established 30, 40 goal wing. Those don't exactly grow on trees. They're hard to find, but Hornqvist, I think, will be looked to as someone who can maybe bring a more responsible two-way game and at the same time provide some scoring on the wing with Geno Malkin.
So we got the Penguins both winning a division. I think that's pretty much going to happen. So we'll move away from them at this time and now move to the New York Rangers, who had that hell of a run going into the Stanley Cup Finals, almost like quite an improbable run in a way. They came back from 3-1 against the Penguins. They went to a Game 7 against Philadelphia, and really, I mean, even going into Stanley Cup Finals and playing out those games, I mean, 4-1 as a series, somebody might look at that on paper and think, well, the Kings really had their way in that series. But if you take a look at that series, I mean, it was a very, very close series. 3 games decided by overtime. The luck goes the other way, and the Rangers may very well walk away with the Stanley Cup themselves. So have they got high expectations to live up to coming into this season?
They do. I mean, we had just had our player media tour at the NHL, and there were a couple of members of the Rangers there. And it seems like the expectation, and not that it will be easy, but they want to get back to the Cup final. For most of the players on that team, that was their first experience in the Stanley Cup final. None of them had been there before. All around New York, the chatter was about the Rangers. There was no real talk about Yankees or Knicks or the NFL. It was all Rangers. And that was something that I think a lot of people in sports and a lot of people on this team were not accustomed to. And they definitely want to get back. They lost a couple of important pieces, which tends to happen unless you're the LA Kings, basically. You're gonna lose, important pieces to a big, deep playoff run. But, they've added some depth. They have some young guys that they're going to look at, especially up front at the forward position. JT Miller is a guy who was up and down in the lineup all last season. Now that Brad Richards is gone at center, it's been, he's going to get a chance to finally establish himself on this team. I think they're capable of getting back. It's not going to be easy, though. But we know they have great defense. They lost Anton Strawman, but they still have a very strong veteran defensive core. They still have Henrik Lundqvist, who a lot of people still consider one of, if not the best goaltender in the world. So they have the pieces. But that's a tough division, and as we all know, anyone can make a run in the playoffs. They benefited, I think, from not having to play a team like the Bruins, who were eliminated in the second round. But it's there, and they want to get back. There's no question about that.
And this is it. The thing is, when it comes to playoffs, you can only beat who's put in front of you. I mean, if people want to turn and say, well, they didn't play the Bruins, well, unfortunately, the Bruins didn't make it. So it was one of those things that they didn't have to face them. I mean, you just touched on Henrik Lundqvist there. I mean, where do you think he ranks? Because, I mean, I thought in the playoffs last year he was incredible. There were some magical moments from Henrik Lundqvist, and for me, he is the best netminder, or certainly one of the top 2 netminders in the NHL right now.
I'd say, yeah, definitely. I mean, I'd say definitely top 2 or 3, probably along with maybe Tuukka Rask or Jonathan Quick. Maybe throw Carey Price of the Montreal Canadiens in that mix. He's just, he's just, what you're getting with him. He's money in the bank, he got off. People forget he got off to a really bad start last season. There was a new coaching staff. There was new league-mandated goaltending equipment that he had to get used to. He was negotiating a contract extension that they eventually signed, but that was a bit of a distraction at the start of the season. So he got off to a poor start. And after that first month when he struggled, from that point on, he was absolutely dominant, had one of the best seasons of his career, which for a goalie as consistent as Henrik, that's really saying something. And, he's up there. This is a team that has absolute confidence in their goaltender. They know that when he's in there, he's going to provide elite goaltending, and he's the face of the franchise. He was on David Letterman the other night. I mean, this is a guy who loves New York. He loves the spotlight. He loves some of the celebrity, I think, that comes with it. That's something that he really enjoys. He doesn't shy away from that. And he is the Rangers. And I think that's one thing you're going to get with this team, that you're not going to score a lot of goals on them because they have Henrik in net.
No, without a doubt. I mean, this is it. It's Henrik. I mean, would you agree the Rangers will be a playoff team next at the end of this season?
Definitely. I think the division is more competitive now. It'll be a challenge, but the expectation is for them to definitely make the playoffs. They have the strong goaltending, they have the strong defense, and the point I like to make with this team is that the real core of this group are guys who are just now entering the prime of their career. I think when you look at their top guys like Ryan McDonough or Chris Kreider or Derek Stepan, Derek Brassard, these are all guys that are all just around 24, 25 years old. They're just about to really, I think, find their game, and find the peak of their game. And they still have strong depth, not like they did last season. I think they love what they got from Alain Vigneault and that coaching staff. So yes, they should definitely make the playoffs.
Excellent. Well, moving away from New York for a moment, we'll come back and talk about the Islanders a bit later, but moving on to Philadelphia, and they had a relatively quiet off-season, but they did lose Scott Hartnell. How much of a loss is he going to be for them?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think that might actually be tougher for the fans than it is for the actual team. He was arguably the most popular player on that team. He seemed to embody a lot of what that team was about. He was one of the toughest matchups in the league. If you had a shift against Scott Hartnell, you were going to be feeling it when you were done that shift. And of course, the frock of curly orange hair, fit well with the Flyers jersey and color scheme. But I think they just felt that he was a veteran player who was getting a little older, and maybe it was time to make a move for someone a bit younger like R.J. Umberger, who could use a change of scenery and was not working out in Columbus. So I think that's a tough one, but I still think that the core of the team is intact. And it's interesting. I think the statement they made this offseason in Philadelphia was that this team we had last season, with the exception of trading Scott Hartnell, this is the team we're going to go with. Which, considering they lost in the first round of the playoffs, is a little surprising. But I guess Paul Holmgren is sort of the mad genius of the salary cap. I'm not sure he's all that familiar with the aspects of the cap. I mean, they spend a lot of money. They spend to the cap, so they don't have a lot of wiggle room when it comes to moving players or signing players. So this is the team they're going with. I think they are competitive, and they'll definitely compete for a playoff spot. But I think kind of overshadowed by the loss of Hartnell are the health issues that defenseman Kimmo Timonen has had this season too, or this summer. He's struggling with blood clots. We don't know all the details. We don't know when he'll be back or if he'll be back. And I think considering what happened with Thomas Vokoun with the Penguins last year, there's a precedent there that he could miss part of the season. And for a reliable veteran defenseman on a team that needs that could be a problem.
No, I was going to come to Timonen in a moment, because obviously that has been a really uncertain times, obviously for Timonen himself, but also the team as well. And with the lack of changes over the off-season, would you fully expect maybe Ron Hextall to make some changes if things don't go well when the season does start?
I think so. I think it's Ron Hextall, as you mentioned, running the team more so than Paul Holmgren, but Paul Holmgren still oversees the team. He's still, this is still you never know what you're going to get with the Flyers. This is always a team. And I say, as a fan, I give them credit for it. This is a team that if a player becomes available, they take a shot at him. They want to take a shot at acquiring quality elite players that are available. We saw it years ago when they signed Shea Weber to an offer sheet. This is a team that is not afraid to make changes. They're one of the older teams in the league, so they might look to get younger at some point. I mean, they got up to a rough start last season. I don't think they want to see that happen again. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they did make changes. The only, as I mentioned before, because of their severe salary cap situation, they're kind of hamstrung. They don't have a lot of room to make moves. So it could be challenging to do that. But one thing I'm pretty sure of is with the Flyers that they're not afraid to try and make a move, especially if they get off to a poor start in a very competitive division. No,
without a doubt. Playoff team for you?
I would say fringe playoff team. They'll be battling for a spot near the end. In the end, it could go anyway. I could see them making the playoffs, but if I had to make an absolute judgment call on this one, I'd say they come close, but they just miss out on a wild card spot.
Yeah, it's going to be tough, isn't it? I mean, playing all these games in this division obviously won't help them. But moving on to Columbus, who clinched our first playoff berth last season since 08 and 09. Is it the expectations for them, isn't it? I mean, now success is beginning to come their way, and it's how they kind of maybe handle that going into this season with almost like an expectation that they should really make the playoffs again.
They should. That's definitely the expectation. That building, everyone that I spoke with said that arena in Columbus was as loud and boisterous as any in the entire league during the playoffs. That the fan base just absolutely rallied around this team. They're a very tough team to play, and they got even tougher to play because they acquired Scott Hartnell, who, as I've already mentioned, is one of the most frustrating players in the league to play against. He doesn't give you an inch, so they'll definitely compete for a playoffs. The expectation is they'll make the playoffs. I think the expectation is that they'll win a series because they still have not done that in the history of the franchise. Although they gave Pittsburgh a pretty good challenge in the first round, last season in the playoffs. But I like this team. I spoke with Craig Hartsburg during the summer, who he's coached in Ottawa, he's coached in Chicago. I mean, he's coached in some established NHL markets, and he told me himself that the building in Columbus and just the energy in the city during the playoffs last summer was as crazy as anything he's seen. And that's coming from an established NHL guy. So that says a lot. And yeah, they have a franchise player in Ryan Johansson who they have to re-sign. He's a restricted free agent, but the expectation is, although he might hold out, is he'll be back at some point. I like their defense. I like Sergei Bobrovsky in net. I think they're a team that I'm looking forward to watching this season.
No, and I think as well, when you've got those young players and that solid net minding as well, you give them a taste of a playoff series, and sometimes the hunger takes over and they start forgetting their young players and then kind of step up to that level. So that's going to be interesting to see exactly how some of these guys do develop over the course of this season.
Absolutely. I mean, they'll hope Nathan Horton is healthy. I think he'll be a huge addition to this team. They signed him a year ago, but he battled shoulder injuries and other related injuries all last season and didn't really have an opportunity to establish himself on that team. He's won a Stanley Cup, so we know that he's going to bring a veteran tough presence. Brandon Dubinsky has established himself and signed a long-term extension this summer with the team. I like this veteran defense. Everyone we've spoken with has said that the kid, Ryan Murray on defense, can straight up play. I mean, that's, you ask, I think, most of the people on that roster about maybe someone that we haven't seen a lot of who we should look out for. They generally have been saying Ryan Murray. He was the second overall pick in 2013 and 2012, excuse me. And he was injured his first year, and this could be a big year for him as well as some other younger players. They have guys like Boone Jenner, Matt Calvert, Cam Atkinson, who are starting to really establish themselves on this roster. So I think that is what this season may be most contingent on for the Columbus Blue Jackets, if these young guys can take the next step in their development.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I've got this team finishing third in the division and making the playoffs. How do you see it, Tal?
That sounds right. I could see them finishing as high as second. I see them making the playoffs. I think they'll need a good start. I think their start was not the best last season, but they made it count. I mean, we know that when it comes to that playoff push, they make a run. That's when they seem to turn their game up, and I see them making the playoffs again. This is going to be a common thread in this conversation, I'm sure. Very competitive division, but I feel like last season not only hardened this team and helped them appreciate the playoffs, but it also, I think, left them with a sense of unfinished business, the way they competed so hard against Pittsburgh but couldn't win that series. So they'll be looking to take that next step this season.
No, without a doubt. And moving now on to Washington, and they've got a new head coach in town in Barry Trotz. And how do you think Ovechkin will adjust to a new coach and a different mentality?
Well, Coach Trotz has been saying in the past few weeks that he's been talking with Ovechkin and that they've been developing chemistry and discussing where they want the team to go. I mean, we're talking about one of the biggest names and the faces of the league. He's probably the most dangerous goal scorer in the entire NHL. he needs to work on his two-way game. He's turned into something of a one-dimensional player. Now, that one dimension he's probably better at than anyone in the world. But he also had one of the worst plus-minus ratings in the league last season. So I think that, I think the thing that Barry Trotz has really talked about is trying to take some of the burden off that first line. This was a very top-heavy offensive team. After Ovechkin and Nicklas Backstrom on that first line, there weren't a ton of contributions, coming from their depth players. Joel Ward and Jason Chimera were fantastic, but I think they're looking to get a little more scoring from their forwards, not named Ovechkin and Backstrom. And for Trotz, I think that's going to come down to, like a lot of teams, giving the younger guys an opportunity to win a top forward position in training camp. The guy he is definitely mentioned more than once is Evgeny Kuznetsov. A Russian like Ovechkin. He's friends with Ovechkin. He had a fantastic career in the Continental Hockey League and was very strong with the Capitals at the end of last season. He's going to get an opportunity to win that second line center position and take some of the burden, the scoring burden, off Backstrom and Ovechkin. And if he can do that, and I have every belief that he can. I mean, he's got a ton of talent. Then I think that'll help the Capitals a lot, and it'll help Ovechkin a lot. I think he'll feel a little less like he has to score the big goal every night.
Yeah, without a doubt. Did you like the moves they made on defense in the off season?
I'm not so much for what they paid for it. I mean, I think that was the big takeaway. This was a team that needed an upgrade on defense. They needed a veteran presence back there and players who could do a number of different things, both in the offensive and defensive zone. And they got that in Matt Niskanen and Brooks Orpik. They basically poached the entire Penguins defense pretty much. But I think Niskanen, I mean, he signed a long-term deal. He's making almost $6 million a year. I think that was kind of expected, especially when you look at some of the other salaries that came out of last summer, especially the PK Subban deal in Montreal. Brooks Orpik, I think that was the one that a lot of people took issue to. I do think he can help this team. I think he'll be a great leader on that blue line, but he is an aging veteran who's had some issues with injuries the past couple of seasons, and they're paying him $5.5 million a year for the next 5 years. I mean, that's a bit much, but I think, they identified a glaring issue with this roster, a real problem that was hurting them, and they said, obviously, owner Ted Leonza said, well, we're willing to spend whatever we have to spend to fix that problem. And they've done that. So you can't fault them there, I guess. No,
this is it. I mean, identifying a need, going to spending the money, that's what a lot of fans would want their franchise to go and do, because there are franchises out there that just won't do it. But where do you see this team come the playoff rating? I've got them as a bubble team.
Yeah, they are a bubble team. I think I like that they hired Barry Trotz. I mean, I think that was a fantastic hire. He's one of the most respected coaches in the league. But it still remains to be seen what effect he'll have on this team. I mean, you look at the personality of a team, the Nashville Predators, who Barry Trotz, coached for over a decade. That was a very different team. You look at the roster there, and that was a real team. That was a team that relied on all its players, that was going to grind out wins, that was never going to try and outskate the opposition. And they weren't a run and gun team. They were a very conservative, responsible two-way team. And he comes over to a Capitals team that was great on one end of the ice and not very productive on the other. So I think that's ultimately what it will come down to. If Barry Trotz can make his imprint on this team and play a bit more his style of hockey, and who knows, maybe even convert Alex Ovechkin into more of a two-way player. I don't think he's ever going to compete for the Selke Trophy for best defensive forward, but if he can maybe make him a more responsible player in his own end and make this team less reliable on the power play and on special teams, then who knows? They could make it and maybe even make a run. But I'd have to agree with you. They are a bubble team. They'll be competing, I think, for that one of those 2 wild card spots at the end of the season, and it's their ability to find chemistry with Trotz that will ultimately determine if they get that wild card spot or not.
No, without a doubt. And moving away from Washington and now into New Jersey, this is almost like the beginning of a new era. Martin Brodeur is no longer in net for the New Jersey Devils. And just before we talk about New Jersey for a minute, where do you rank Martin Brodeur in the history of netminders? I mean, for me, I've grown up watching hockey for over 20 years now, and he's right up there in my lifetime with guys like Patrick Waugh and Dominik Hasek.
No question. I think we had a generation of goalies coming into the league who cited Patrick Waugh as their main influence, as their idol, and I think before long we're going to have the same with a group of goalies coming into the league talking about how Martin Brodeur made them want to, pick up the pads and strap them on and become a goalie. So he's one of the greats. You could definitely make the case for him being the greatest of all time. He owns all the major, goaltending statistical records. He's done everything there is to do in the game. I think it's a little unfortunate, the way his career is starting to come to a close, and he's still a free agent, and I'm not sure how much interest he's really garnered from too many teams in the league, but he's going to be considered one of the best of all time once it's all over. I personally, I'd probably put him behind players like Waugh, but he's a first ballot Hall of Famer, and he's, like I said, accomplished every single thing there is to accomplish as a goalie in the National Hockey League.
No, without a doubt. And does it make life easier for Schneider this year coming into the season without having that godlike netminder in Brodeur almost over his shoulder or almost competing for the same job?
I think so. I think, in fact, that one of Lou Lamoriello's main objectives for this season was to officially turn this team over to Corey Schneider. And I think, Corey Schneider, his entire career, from when he was in Vancouver to when he came to New Jersey, has been dealing with goaltending controversies. Mm-hmm. And for years now has been asked, well, who should start, you or the other guy? And, Corey Schneider's smart enough not to say, smart enough to know not that he shouldn't tell Devils fans that he should be starting over Martin Brodeur, even though he should. Mm-hmm. And he probably should have actually started more games last year. And Martin Brodeur should have played fewer games last year. They should have basically weaned him off. Weaned this team off Brodeur and really turned it over to Schneider during the regular season. But they signed him to a huge extension. He is, Schneider is the guy in New Jersey now. He was, I think, fantastic last year, playing with zero offensive support. I mean, this is a team that couldn't score at all. And I think they've added some depth, up front. They signed Michael Camilleri in the offseason. Ryan Clough might be healthier this year. And I actually like the Devils this year. I'm looking forward to see them. I think they have their defense is a little porous, but it is young. It could improve. I think they have as much depth up front as any team in this division. I think you look at their top three scoring lines, it's all players that we've seen. It's all players that we know have the potential to get results offensively. So I actually see them, getting back to the playoffs this season. You look at last season, the only reason they didn't make the playoffs was because they couldn't score a single goal in the shootout. They lost 10 games in the shootout. If they win those games, they make the playoffs. It's that simple. So I'm not sure they've improved their shootout performance. I mean, they didn't really bring in any players that are going to help them win in the shootout. But if they win half of their shootouts, they'll have a much better chance of making the playoffs. So yeah, I like the Devils. I think they'll be interesting to watch.
Did they petition the league in the off-season to get rid of them?
I wouldn't be surprised if they did. I mean, the league announced yesterday that the spinorama is now no longer legal in the shootout, so that might help them out a little bit. But yeah, I think if there's any team that is not too high on the concept of the shootout, it would be the New Jersey Devils. I mean, it just killed them last year. It absolutely destroyed them. They went, I said 10 losses. They actually went 0-13 in the shootout. That's 13 extra points, and they finished 5 points out of the playoffs. So you win half of those, you make the playoffs. And I think it's probably a bit unfair. You can make the point, well, if they weren't in those shootouts in the first place, they would have eliminated the problem there. It's probably unfair to boil it all down just to shootouts, but it's a glaring issue for this team. And I think by bringing in guys like Camilleri and trying to make this more of a veteran team, they've said, we don't have Parise or Kovalchuk anymore. We don't have these guaranteed scoring guys in the shootout, so we're just going to try and bring in guys to eliminate the shootout altogether, so we just don't have to deal with it anymore.
No, this is it. I mean, those kind of stats just jump off the page, and things can go completely the other way, and that could have had a completely different outcome for the Devils last season. I've got the Devils finishing in fourth and probably going back to the playoffs.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think they should definitely be back. Like I said, I like their forward depth. I think Schneider has an opportunity to really establish himself as an elite goalie. I like their coaching staff. I think Pete DeBoer has done a great job with this team. I think the perception last year, because they got off to such a horrible start and they missed the playoffs, was, oh, it's over in Jersey. It's the end of an era. You know, Martin Brodeur was on the way out. So I do think the perception among a lot of fans was, oh, they're rebuilding this team. They're starting from scratch. I don't see that as the case at all. I think they have some good young players who are going to come in, particularly on defense, with guys like Merrill and Jelena. And I'm with you. I think they'll be back in the playoffs. And this is a team that we know if you get a hot goalie and some strong veteran play in the playoffs, anything can happen. So I could see them being potentially a dangerous team in the playoffs as well.
Yeah, this is it. We've seen netminders take teams to the finals on their own back. And I always point to the Jonathan Quick a few years ago with the Kings, where he pretty much carried that Kings team on his shoulders and had this attitude of, well, you're not going to get the puck past me. So if you do end up with that with Corey Schneider, then the Devils could very well go quite far.
Absolutely.
So moving on to Carolina, we've got a couple more teams to go. Is one of the big concerns for Carolina coming into this season the lack of depth really on their forward lines?
There's a lot of issues with this team, I'd have to say. That is one of them. I mean, spoiler alert, I see, basically the way I see this division going down is Pittsburgh wins it, Carolina finishes last, and in between, who knows? That's basically my 20-word or less synopsis of the Metropolitan division. I don't, this is a team. There are trade rumors involving the Stalls, or even Eric Stahl, who's been the face of this team for so long. It seems like, I do like hiring Bill Peters in the off season. This was a team that needed to make changes with the coaching staff in the front office. They've done that. They didn't make that many changes with their roster. They have a very sort of muddled goaltending situation. I think if they can trade Cam Ward, which will be very difficult with that contract, they will try to trade him. But again, he's making over $6 million a year for the next 2 years. So it's going to be a challenge finding a team that is willing to take on that kind of contract. I think this is going to be a frustrating season for Hurricanes fans. They definitely have some great top end talent, especially up front. They have Alex Semin and Jordan and Eric Stahl, Jeff Skinner. I think Yuri Talusti, is a nice piece, and it just drops off a cliff from that point. They don't really have any depth up front. I think their defense also lacks a great deal of depth. The irony is the one position where they do have solid depth is goaltending, and you only need one goalie every night. So I would see this being sort of a rebuilding season. I wouldn't be surprised if they perhaps even blew things up and made some surprising trades over the course of the season. Ron Francis is now officially running the team, and he's someone who obviously has roots with this organization, and he wants to see them win, and I think he's willing to shake things up in order to do that.
And moving to this division probably didn't help them really, coming from the Southeast division.
No, they are definitely a team. I mean, you could say that about every team from the Southeast, I guess. But this is a division that does not help the Hurricanes. And being in the Southeast, I mean, I think that was sort of a theory with a lot of people watching that division, that so many years of competing in this weak division sort of made these teams unprepared for when they were eventually moved to a stronger division and would be forced to play more games against elite competition. I mean, you look at Carolina, Washington, Florida, teams like that have had a hard time so far adapting to the reconfigured division. So, I think Carolina is a team that is in a very sort of, unfortunately, very frustrating place right now in terms of, I think for the past few years, they were like, if I could cross from one sport to the other, they were kind of like one of these Milwaukee Buck teams. You know what I mean? They were not good enough to make the playoffs, but not so bad that you'd get a top draft pick. So they've been getting these top 10 picks, but no top 5 picks.
Yeah.
So they haven't been good enough to make the playoffs. They're still not good enough to make the playoffs. And I think this might be the year where that finally does all catch up with them, and they probably do get that top 5 pick that they desperately need.
No, without a doubt. I'm exactly the same as you. I've got them in the base winners divisions. We won't dwell on this any longer for any Carolina fans that are listening to this. Moving on finally to the the New York Islanders, I mean, one of the big things that they struggled with last season was their record at home. They've surely got to improve that in this coming season.
They will, and I think there is, because of some of the moves they made during the summer, there is some excitement around this team. They're moving to Brooklyn the following season. So, I mean, players have already started talking about that. I don't know if that is a good thing or a bad thing that players are already discussing moving to the new building when they still have one season left in the old building. But, you know, I think the Islanders should definitely improve. I mean, as much as I was harping on how bad the Hurricanes are, it was actually the Islanders who finished last in this division last year, and they should definitely improve. I think the big move, in my opinion, I think in the opinion of most people, was they completely overhauled their goaltending. I think this was a team that a lot of people felt had some great young talent, but not much in the way of goaltending. I mean, I like Evgeny Nabokov. I think he was good for that team, but it was clear that they need an established number one guy who is entering his prime, and they got that in getting Yaroslav Halak, who, mind you, I think they signed to a very reasonable long-term contract on top of it. You know, they also brought in Chad Johnson, who's an established backup, to help him out. So I don't know when was the last time anyone's been able to say this, but I like the Islanders' goaltending. You know, I think that'll be a strength for this team. They have fantastic depth up front. They brought in Kulemin and Grabowski, who had great chemistry. They're great friends and had great chemistry together with the Toronto Maple Leafs. They have an absolute, you know, treasure trove, if I can use that term, of young prospects that are going to get a long look this year. Ryan Strome, I think, will be looked to take on a bigger role with the offense. Michael Dalcoli, 5th pick overall in the draft, might get a chance to make the team out of training camp. You know, I think, you know, Garth Snow, dare we say it, had a great offseason. I think he did a lot of good things for this team, and I think the future is pretty good for the Islanders. Are they going to make the playoffs? That is the ultimate question, though, I guess, right?
Yeah, I think they're just going to fall short of the playoffs. I mean, I think they might finish in that 6th or 7th spot in that division, but I think the thing is they're going to come undone because of how tough this division is.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it's still a very inexperienced team. It's still a very young team. You know, their blue line still, as much as they've done with other parts of their roster, their blue line still needs a lot of help. They signed Travis Hamonic long term. I like him. I think they do have some good young talent there. Griffin Reinhart will get a chance to make the team out of training camp. But their real veteran presence is Lubo Visnovsky, and I don't know if he's going to make it through the season. I mean, he's had so many issues with injuries, especially concussions, these last few years, and we're learning more and more about the effects of these brain injuries that I'm not sure, you know, I'm not sure they can really rely on him to be that veteran presence this season, just because I'm not sure he'll be able to remain healthy. So, you know, with Garth Snow, I think he will look to make a deal for a veteran defenseman at some point, but they simply don't have that yet. And you do need that defense to win games. And so I think they'll be strong offensively. I think their special teams will be great. I just think the blue line will be an issue. And in this division particularly where you do have teams like the Rangers, like the Penguins, Capitals, Blue Jackets that have, you know, that are strong on defense, I think that's going to be a problem for the Islanders. I think it'll be fun in March and April, seeing them make a run on Long Island before moving to Barclays Center. But like you said, I think they will end up just short.
No, without a doubt. And that's it. That is the Metropolitan Division.
That's it.
As we look forward to the new NHL season, Tal, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and previewing this division. It's been a pleasure talking to you as always.
Thanks, Stephen. Anytime.
No problem at all. Please let everyone know where they can find you on Twitter.
I am at Tal Pinch, TalPinch, and that is probably the main place to find me. I'm not really on Facebook, so yeah, Twitter. If you can stand some of my insight on bad television, then yeah, you can find me there.
Bad television, NHL insight, and he's also wrote a book as well.
That's right. Breakaway is available from HarperCollins. It tells the story of a number of the Soviet and Czechoslovakian players who defected during the Cold War. So, yes, I'll give a shameless little plug for that as well.
No, without a doubt. Plug away, because it's a fantastic book, and We did
Thank
talk
you.
about it on a previous episode of the podcast. I implore anyone that's looking for a hockey book or wanting someone to buy them a hockey book for Christmas, that's probably the one to get.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the extra plug there. Thanks.
Tal, once again, a pleasure talking to you, and look forward to talking to you again as the season progresses.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
No problem at all. Thanks again, Tal.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Come out, won't you turn my soul into